Picture this. You are a man who has built a fortress of faith in a godless land. A land of dust and bone, where hope is a currency more precious than gold and far, far scarcer. Your hands, calloused and scarred, were once meant for a different life, a life of holding another's hand, of building a home. Now they build pews and mend the broken souls that wash up on your doorstep. You are Father Michael, a name you took on like a heavy coat to shield you from the biting wind of memory. But what happens when the one soul you could never save, the ghost that haunts the quiet corridors of your heart, walks back into your life? Not as a whisper on the wind, but as a starving child, her small hand clutching a memory you thought was buried forever beneath the unforgiving dust. What do you do when the past doesn't just knock on your door, but threatens to tear it from its very hinges? The storm that night was a living thing. It clawed at the stained glass windows of the Church of the Redeemer, its voice a mournful howl that echoed the desolate cries of the surrounding wilderness. Father Michael stood before the altar, the flickering candlelight casting his tall, gaunt figure in a dance of shadow and light. He was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, his face a testament to a sorrow he rarely spoke of. A long, thin scar, a pale memory of violence, ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, pulling it into a perpetual frown. He had come to the town of redemption 20 years ago, a man running from a name and a life that had burned to ash. He'd built this church with his own hands, stone by heavy stone, a penance that never seemed to end. A sound, faint and desperate, cut through the gale. A scratching. It was like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Michael paused, his head tilted. Came again, weaker this time. He took a lantern from its hook, the golden light pushing back the oppressive gloom, and walked the long aisle to the heavy oak doors. He pulled back the iron bolt, the sound echoing in the cavernous space, and leaned his shoulder into the wood. The wind tore the door from his grip, slamming it open against the stone wall. And there, collapsed on the threshold, was a girl. She was little more than a skeleton draped in rags, her matted hair clinging to a face pale as death. She looked no older than 16 or 17, a child of the cruel frontier. Her eyes were closed, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. As Michael knelt, the lantern light caught a glint of silver against the hollow of her throat. A chain, delicate and tarnished, held a simple oval locket. His own breath caught in his chest. A sudden, violent stillness took hold of him, more profound than the heart of the storm. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. He didn't need to see the engraving. He knew it by heart. He had traced its lines 1,000 times in his memory, a phantom touch against a phantom loss. He lifted it into the light. There it was, etched into the worn silver, a single perfect desert rose. The locket he had given his wife, Isabella, the day he asked her to run away with him. The locket that had vanished with her into the empty desert all those years ago. He stared down at the unconscious child, a ghost from a life he had tried to crucify, and the carefully constructed walls of Father Michael began to crumble, revealing the raw, bleeding heart of the man he once was. Elias. He carried her inside, her weight next to nothing in his arms, and laid her gently on a cot near the hearth. The fire crackled, casting a warm, life-giving glow upon her ashen features. For hours he worked with a silent, desperate intensity. He cleaned the grime from her face with a soft, damp cloth, revealing delicate features that were a painful echo of another's. He spooned warm broth between her cracked lips, a prayer forming with every careful movement. She was consumed by a fever, tossing and turning, her whispers filled with fragmented nightmares of darkness and pursuit. Through it all, her hand never loosened its grip on the locket, holding it like a talisman against the horrors of the world. Michael sat in a wooden chair beside her, watching, waiting, his mind a maelstrom of unanswerable questions. This girl couldn't be his. Isabella had disappeared 20 years ago. This child was too young. Yet, the locket, it was an anchor, a physical piece of a past he believed had been entirely consumed by tragedy. Days bled into a week. The storm outside passed, leaving the land washed clean under a vast, indifferent sky. Inside the church, a fragile peace began to take root. The girl, whose name he learned was Alara, slowly returned to the world of the living. Her eyes, the color of a twilight sky, began to hold awareness instead of just terror. But she was silent, a wild creature tamed by exhaustion but not by trust. She watched his every move, her gaze wary, her body tense to flee. He never pushed. He simply left food by her cot, kept the fire burning, and sat across the room reading his Bible, his presence a steady, unassuming constant. He learned the landscape of her trauma through the things she did not do. She flinched from sudden movements. She never turned her back on the door. She ate as if the food might be snatched away at any moment. And he learned the geography of his own grief anew. He saw Isabella in the stubborn set of Alara's jaw, in the way a stray lock of dark hair fell across her forehead. These glimpses were daggers to his soul, twisting with a pain he thought had long since dulled to a bearable ache. Who was this child? Was she a cruel joke played by fate? A messenger sent to remind him of his greatest failure? One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the tall, arched window, painting rainbows on the stone floor, he found her tracing the desert rose on her locket. Her touch was reverent. "It was my mother's," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. It was the first time she had spoken of it. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs. He kept his own voice steady, gentle. "It's beautiful. Did she tell you where she got it?" Alara shook her head, her eyes clouding over. "She only said it was a promise of a better place. She told me to run, to follow the sun until I found this town, this church. She said a good man was here." Her gaze fell away, back to the locket. "She died before she could tell me his name. Promise." The word resonated deep within him. That's what he had called it when he'd placed it around Isabella's neck. A promise of a life free from the man she was bound to. A cruel merchant who saw her as nothing more than a beautiful possession. They were supposed to escape together, but her husband's men had caught up to them. There was a fight, chaos, and when the dust settled, she was gone. He was left for dead, with a scar on his face and a hole in his soul. He had assumed the worst, that she had been killed. He had fled, changed his name, and dedicated his life to God as an act of penance for failing to protect her. Now, this child's words planted a seed of impossible, terrifying hope. Could Isabella have survived? Could this girl? His mind recoiled from the thought. It was too much to even consider. He decided, for Alara's sake, to let the past remain buried. He would be the good man her mother had promised. He would be her sanctuary. Slowly, meticulously, he began to stitch a life for her within the church walls. He taught her to read, her finger tracing the words in his Bible. He showed her how to tend the small, tenacious garden he cultivated behind the church, a patch of vibrant green in a world of brown. They worked in comfortable silence, the shared tasks forming a language more meaningful than words. He watched as the haunted look in her eyes was gradually replaced by a quiet curiosity. A ghost of a smile would sometimes touch her lips when a stubborn desert bloom finally opened its petals. She was healing, and in healing her, Michael felt parts of himself, long since numb and forgotten, flicker back to life. The church, once his solitary refuge of atonement, began to feel like a home. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft rustle of pages turning, the gentle rhythm of two people learning to breathe again, together. But redemption was a town built on secrets, and its foundations were rotten. The peace they had found was as fragile as a pane of stained glass, and the man who ruled the town was about to cast the first stone. The shadow of Silas Blackwood fell long and dark over the town of redemption. He owned the silver mine that was the town's lifeblood and, by extension, he owned the town. His wealth was a fortress, his influence a weapon, and his men were a plague of locusts, consuming all they touched. They were brutish, arrogant men who strode through the dusty streets as if they owned the very ground, which, in many ways, they did. Father Michael's church was the only piece of redemption that Blackwood did not control, an island of quiet defiance in a sea of corruption. For years, an unspoken truce had existed between them. Blackwood left the priest to his flock of lost souls, and the priest did not interfere with Blackwood's grim business. The truce shattered on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. Two of Blackwood's foremen swaggered into the church, their spurs ringing out on the stone floor, an ugly, discordant sound in the sacred silence. They reeked of cheap whiskey and entitlement. "Priest," the larger one grunted, not bothering with a greeting. "We're lookin' for a runaway." A young one stole something from Mr. Blackwood. From the choir loft where she had been sweeping, Ilara froze. Her face went slack with a primal, absolute terror. It was as if she had been turned to stone. She pressed herself back into the shadows, making herself small, invisible. Michael stepped between the men and the altar, his presence a calm, immovable object. "There is no one here but me," he said, his voice low and even, betraying none of the sudden ice in his veins. The foreman sneered, his eyes scanning the empty pews. "If you see her, you let us know. Mr. Blackwood doesn't take kindly to thieves. Or to those who help him." They turned and left, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings, a desecration of the peace. Michael climbed the stairs to the loft. Ilara was huddled in a corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, trembling uncontrollably. He knelt before her, his heart aching at the sight of her raw fear. "Ilara," he said softly, "do you know those men?" She couldn't speak, only nodding, her eyes wide and sightless, locked on a horror only she could see. The past she had run from had found her. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was only the beginning. Days later, Silas Blackwood came himself. He arrived not in a cloud of dust and fury, but with the quiet menace of a serpent. He was a handsome man in a tailored black coat, his silver hair immaculate, his eyes the color of polished steel. He did not enter the church, but stood on the steps, a gesture of feigned respect that was more insulting than open hostility. "Father," he began, his voice smooth as oiled leather, "I believe some of my employees paid you a visit. I've come to apologize for their lack of decorum." Michael met his gaze, refusing to be disarmed by the false courtesy. "They were looking for someone." Blackwood smiled, a thin, predatory curving of his lips. "Indeed, a piece of my property has gone missing. An indentured girl from one of my more remote camps. She is bound to me by law, a debt inherited from her mother." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Her mother was a stubborn woman. Worked for me for nearly 20 years. Died recently. The girl seems to have inherited her spirit. She also stole an heirloom of some sentimental value." Every word was a hammer blow against Michael's carefully constructed calm. 20 years. A mother who just died. An heirloom. He felt the blood drain from his face. "I have not seen such a girl," he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Blackwood's steely eyes narrowed, searching Michael's face for the lie. "A shame. If you do, I expect you'll remember where your loyalties lie. This town provides for you, Father. It would be unwise to disrupt the natural order of things." The threat was clear, delivered with the chilling precision of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving a profound and suffocating silence in his wake. Michael closed the heavy doors, the bolts sliding home with a sound of finality. He turned to face Ilara, who had been listening from the shadows, her face a mask of despair. The time for secrets was over. "Ilara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. "Your mother. What was her name?" She looked up at him, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her dirt-streaked cheeks. "Isabella?" she whispered, the name a fragile, broken thing. Her name was Isabella. The world tilted on its axis. The impossible, terrifying hope he had suppressed now bloomed into agonizing certainty. Isabella had lived. She had been a prisoner all this time. And this girl, this child he had taken in, was not just a stranger bearing his wife's memory. She was his daughter, the daughter he never knew he had. He sank onto a pew, the weight of 20 lost years crashing down upon him. He was not Father Michael, the redeemed priest. He was Elias, the failed protector, the husband who had not searched hard enough, the father who had never been. Alara watched him, her own grief momentarily forgotten in the face of his overwhelming sorrow. She said the man who gave her the locket was named Elias, she said softly. She said he was strong and good. She told me to find him. She said he would keep me safe. He looked at his child, his daughter, and saw in her tear-filled eyes not an accusation, but a desperate, flickering plea. The promise her mother had made now fell to him to keep. And Silas Blackwood was coming to collect. The revelation settled not as a comfort, but as a declaration of war. The man known as Father Michael died in that moment, and Elias was resurrected, forged anew in a crucible of grief and righteous fury. He was no longer a man atoning for a past failure. He was a father with a future to defend. He looked at Alara, truly looked at her, and saw not just the ghost of Isabella but a fierce, resilient spirit that was all her own. His daughter. The word was a fire in his blood, burning away 2 decades of hollow piety. His purpose, once clouded by guilt, was now blindingly clear. He would not fail his family again. The storm broke 2 days later, not with rain and thunder, but with the clatter of hooves and the grim finality of the law. Silas Blackwood returned, but this time he was not alone. Beside him rode Sheriff Miller, a man whose loyalty was bought and paid for, his tin star a mockery of the justice it was meant to represent. Behind them, a half-dozen of Blackwood's armed foremen formed a menacing posse. They stopped before the church, an invading army laying siege to a holy place. The townspeople, drawn by the commotion, gathered at a distance, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They were sheep, and the wolf had come to the shepherd's door. Blackwood dismounted, a roll of parchment in his hand. "Father Michael," he called out, his voice ringing with triumphant authority. "There's no need for this to be unpleasant. I have a legal writ here, an indenture contract, signed by Isabella Vargas, binding her and any of her issue to my service until her debt is repaid. It is legally ironclad. The girl, Alara, is my property. Sheriff Miller is here to enforce the law." He held up the parchment, a death sentence written in ink. Elias opened the church doors and stepped out onto the top step, positioning himself between them and everything he had left to love in the world. He was dressed not in his priest's vestments, but in simple, rugged trousers and a worn shirt, the clothes of the man he used to be. The townsfolk murmured, seeing the stark transformation. "Her name is Alara," he said, his voice quiet but carrying with an astonishing power that cut through the tense air. "She is not property." Blackwood chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Sentiment is a luxury you can't afford, Father. Now send out the girl." Elias's gaze was unflinching. He reached up to his neck and slowly, deliberately, unfastened the stiff white collar of the priesthood. He held it in his hand for a moment before letting it fall to the stone step. "My name is not Father," he declared, his voice rising, resonating with a strength no one in redemption had ever heard from him. "My name is Elias, and you are standing on my land, trying to take my daughter." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. This changed everything. This was no longer a legal matter of a priest harboring a runaway. It was a father defending his child. Blackwood's handsome face twisted into a mask of pure rage. The facade of civility was gone. "I don't care what you call yourself," he snarled. "That girl is mine. Get her." 2 of his men, emboldened by their numbers, started up the steps. Elias didn't hesitate. The years of hard labor, of lifting stone and timber, had kept him strong. The memory of how to fight, a skill learned in a life before the priesthood, came back to him in a flash of instinct. He met the first man with a hard right cross that sent him staggering back down the steps. He used the second man's momentum against him, grabbing his arm and throwing him into the first. It was not the brawling of a thug, but the efficient, desperate defense of a man with nothing left to lose. The other foremen drew their weapons. It was about to become a massacre. But then, something shifted in the crowd. A voice, old and gravelly, called out. "He's right," it was old Jedediah, a miner whose life Elias had saved last winter when a lung fever had nearly taken him. Jedediah limped forward, holding a rusty pickaxe. "The father, Elias, he took me in, fed me. He's a good man," another voice joined in. It was Martha, a widow whose children would have starved if not for the church garden's charity. She stepped forward, standing beside Jedediah. "He's one of us," then the stable boy, then the blacksmith, then a dozen more. One by one, the forgotten, the broken, the mended souls of redemption moved forward. They were not an army. They had no weapons to speak of. But they formed a human wall at the bottom of the church steps, a silent, defiant barricade between Blackwood's power and Elias's family. They were the found family, forged in shared hardship and now united in courage. Silas Blackwood stared at the sea of determined faces. His power had always been absolute because the people had always been afraid and divided. In that moment they were neither. He saw the loyalty he had tried to buy with wages and fear given freely to a man for kindness and respect. His authority, built on a foundation of intimidation, crumbled into dust. The sheriff, seeing the tide turn, would not risk a bloodbath against the entire town. He held up a hand. "That's enough, Silas. It's over." Blackwood's face was a study in apoplectic fury. He shot a look of pure venom at Elias, a silent promise of future vengeance. But for today he was beaten. He spat on the ground, mounted his horse and rode away, his posse trailing behind him like a defeated pack of dogs. The crowd erupted in a cheer. On the top step of the church, Elias stood, his chest heaving. The door opened behind him and Alara rushed out, throwing her arms around his waist, sobbing with relief and a dawning, wondrous joy. He wrapped his arms around her, holding his daughter for the first time, and looked out at the faces of the townspeople. He saw not a flock he had tended, but a family that had risen up to protect him in return. The church was no longer a monument to his past and his penance. It was a home, built not just of stone, but of love, courage, and true redemption. In the quiet days that followed, the town of redemption was reborn. The pall of fear that had suffocated it for so long had lifted, leaving behind the clean, crisp air of possibility. Elias, no longer hiding behind the cloth, became a different kind of leader, a pillar of a community that was learning to stand on its own feet. He and Alara found a new rhythm, not as priest and ward, but as father and daughter. They worked together in the garden, their hands in the soil, planting seeds for the future. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and violet, they sat on the church steps. Elias took the silver locket from around Alara's neck. With a gentle click, he opened it. Inside, protected by the worn metal, was a tiny, faded portrait of a woman with a fiery spirit in her eyes, Isabella. She looked just like an older, more confident version of Alara. "Your mother," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the bravest person I ever knew. She never stopped fighting for a better life. She never lost hope. That hope is what she gave to you." Alara traced the tiny image with her finger, a tear of sorrow and gratitude rolling down her cheek. She wasn't just the legacy of her mother's suffering. She was the fulfillment of her mother's promise. The locket was no longer a symbol of what was lost, but a testament to a love strong enough to outlast death and despair. What is the true measure of a person's strength? Is it the walls they build to keep the world out, or the doors they open to let others in? Elias built a church to hide from his past, to entomb his guilt in stone and prayer. But in the end, it was love, the fierce, protective love for a daughter he never knew he had, that became his true sanctuary. We all face storms in our lives. We all carry lockets, heavy with memories of what we've lost. But how many of us would have the courage to cast off the disguise we wear, to stand in the doorway, and fight when the past comes knocking? How many of us, when faced with true evil, would inspire others to find their own strength? Let me know what you would have done in the comments below. And if this story of redemption and the power of a found family touched your heart, be sure to like and subscribe for more tales of the enduring power of the human spirit.